Hello and welcome back to Prism and Company. On the docket today, we have the 18 Oracle. Now, if you have not heard of the 18 Oracle before, I certainly wouldn't blame you. This is actually a project that I created, and I made it about 2 years ago, promptly put it on the shelf, and never told a soul. That is until maybe a month ago, where I just sort of on a whim found this and threw up some images on my Instagram channel, my Instagram page, and just got a really lovely reception for it. So much so that I decided to digitally recreate this deck and give it away. I'm currently in the process of giving away 8 of these decks of the 18 Oracle, which is just so exciting. And congrats again if you won one. What you're looking at here is the little guidebook that I made. There's a full reproduction of each card, even in color, and then some information. And we're going to go through all this goodness here. What I wanted to do today was show you the original deck and also the reproduction. I'm going to break down how I actually made it, the system that goes in behind it, why I chose to order it the way I did, what the card backs mean, what the images on the cards mean. We're just going to kind of take our time and really dig our teeth in. There's only 18 cards, but I'm chatty, so I'll probably have a lot to say. Without further ado, I say let's dive right in. All right, here is the actual deck itself. Now this is the OG 18 Oracle. This is 100% handmade, and it is thick as all get out. Just for reference, here is the reproduction. This is on like normal playing card tarot paper, and this is actually 2 pieces of 200-pound cold press watercolor paper glued together. So I hand did all the backs and I hand did all the fronts. Then I glued them together and pressed them under a book so they'd lay flat. Then I trimmed all the edges so they, went nice into the edge. Then I edged all these with a black marker. So when you looked at it from the side, you get a kind of nice black look. If you're curious how I got the backs to be so consistent, I actually used a stencil for this. So I made this image and then I used a light board and I put that image down, light shone through the paper, and I put the watercolor paper on top and just traced over each line. Then I used a ruler and a black pen to crisp up all the lines, and then used metallic gold ink, which you can really see that shine, and black watercolor to kind of fill in all those details. That's one of the things I love about this being kind of a handmade piece, is that gold ink really, really shines. And this is literally raw watercolor paper, so it kind of rubs off on your finger too if you hold it too much. The fact that this is literally watercolor paper makes me so stressed to even handle this, just because any oils from my skin, anything I spill on this, if I get any kind of moisture on it, they're done. So I've kind of come to terms with the fact that, much like life, these are impermanent. They are here for now, but will not be forever. And I'm actually really glad I now have a digital reproduction of them too. If anything does happen to this set, I have one as kind of a backup, or as many as I want, really. I do just want to kind of scroll through some of these backs here. They are all different, again, just because I had to hand make each one of them. And I think that gives us a lot of charm. There's something about handmade stuff that I really like. I did pick this back as the singular back for the reproduction though, just in case somebody did want to use it. I didn't want you to be able to tell which card was which, in case you wanted to, randomly draw. And I wanted to pick one though that was plenty imperfect, so lots of kind of stuff bleeding off the edges. All right, that's a little bit about the physical deck itself. Next up, we're going to chat about the backs, which really break down the system behind the 18 Oracle. And then we're going to go card by card. We're going to talk about the meanings of them, the challenge that's associated with them. That's a real kind of core part of this deck, and make our way through. Should be exciting. All right, the card backs. I'm using one of my reproductions here just so I don't have to handle the original too terribly much. This symbol that I designed directly relates to the system that's built into the Prism Oracle. Nope, not Prism Oracle, 18 Oracle. If I say Prism Tarot or Prism Oracle, I'm also working on a tarot deck called the Prism Tarot, and I always get them confused. So you'll just have to forgive me if I say those two in conjunction. In this particular case, I always mean the 18 Oracle. Here we can see there are 18 circles around the edge of this little wheel. 6 of those circles are in gold and the rest are in white. And we also have this triangle of gold in the center. This deck is based around what I call cores. there are three cores of a person: spirit, mind, and body. Now, that's just for the purposes of this deck. Of course, there are many ways to kind of slice and dice the human experience and break them down, but I needed something to go on. So that's what I settled on for this. Each of those cores is represented by one of the cards. So there is a card for spirit, a card for mind, and a card for body. You can see here in the center, two edges also kind of fracture off and find another card. So these cards represent the blending of two cores. So here we have spirit and body. This core represents spirit and body. This one represents spirit and mind, or mind and body. So those are kind of subsets of those cards too. So those are the six majors, if you will, in this deck. And then everything in between is like a minor, if we're going to relate this to a tarot deck. What these guys are one of the cores filtered through the lens of one of the four classic elements. If you are not familiar with the classic elements, they are fire, which kind of represents passion, excitement, and energy; water, which is your emotions, kind of the deeper depths of you; air, which is all about thoughts and intellect; and earth, which is kind of the crunchy physicality of life, your body, your money, all that kind of stuff. So here we'd have spirit through air, earth, fire, water. And then we have each of those cores, reflected in those four different ways. And the deck starts off with the spirit cards, then it goes to the mind, and then it ends up with the body. And I'll show you some more about the organization and how I picked the numbers for the cards 1 through 18, because there's a little bit of variation in there. This deck is also really based around the number 217, which admittedly is a little bit random, but that is my personal favorite number. It's basically a sacred number at this point to me, for lots of different reasons, but I'll go into a whole bunch of stuff around the number 217, and also silence my phone so it doesn't keep ringing. I wanted to turn up the lights a little bit there. It was getting a little bit dim, and I thought it was time to actually show off some of the cards. I've been talking long enough. Now I want to show you each card with the original version and the reproduction, partially just so you can kind of see how it translated to digital. I think it's always cool to kind of see the original work next to the reproduction, because any artist will tell you it's never exactly what you want it to be. Even though I couldn't do actual gold ink on this, the way it was printed, there actually is a little bit of shine to the gold, which is cool. It's not really metallic, but it definitely is reflective. So it gives off a little bit of that vibe, which makes me happy. You may also notice that some of the numbers and some of the text might move just slightly. I tried to avoid that whenever possible. I really wanted to keep the handmade feel of these cards in the reproductions. I kept as many errors as I could, but sometimes the text was just too low, or sometimes the numbers were too high, and I had to ooch them in just a little bit to actually make them printable. The last thing I wanted was for text to actually be cut off the card from a printing error or something like that. So first up, we have card number 1, which is Prism. Prism is one of our core cards, and it's one of the three kind of main core cards. This one represents the mind. Prism, the mind, comes first in the deck because any experience we have, any information we take in, any knowledge or wisdom or spiritual experience always is processed through the brain. Our brain is our reality. Whatever we think becomes. And I guess there are many ways to look at humanity, but I think that's a fairly safe way to kind of view life. So it was really important for me to have mind up first. Looking at the actual image itself, gold in this deck represents source. And when I say source, I kind of mean everything. So not the world, not the galaxy, not the universe, but like everything. What the universe is made up of, the unseen laws that kind of underwrite all of reality. Reality itself, potentially alternate realities, if I could speak. Dimensions, parallel dimensions, whatever you want to throw into there. I have various thoughts about what does and does not exist, but literally anything you want to pack into your worldview, that is what source is in this deck. So here we have unfiltered source pouring into this prism. This very physical object. That's what black is, or gray in this deck. It's anything kind of physical. And then being refracted all down here and kind of spreading out. This was actually a really big inspiration for the Prism Tarot too. Kind of the thought process behind this deck. More on that later. We'll stay focused on these cards here. But the same way that source is kind of being filtered through something physical into a way that we are experiencing it, so do our thoughts get filtered through the mind and then kind of refracted into each little moment of our life. So that's kind of the intention behind the image. The other thing to keep in mind with the 18 Oracle is that each of these cards directly represents a challenge. That was really the intention behind why I made this deck. I wanted you to draw cards to face challenges. And I've actually designed this deck to be used pretty rarely. A lot of cards you might do like a daily draw with, or pull 5 or 6 cards for a spread or a reading. With the Prism Tarot, I designed it specifically so you draw 2 cards only when you're ready to face a challenge. So for me, throughout the entirety of the year, I used it 4 times. I drew my first set of challenges and I was like, woof, okay, that's going to be a big one. And it took me months until I was like, I think I'm maybe ready for another one. And then I drew a second one. I'm like, why do I do this to myself? But that's kind of the idea. There are individual challenges for the individual cards. So you could certainly draw 1 card too and just face that challenge. But what I like to do is draw 2 of them and kind of find on the Venn diagram of meaning, where do those 2 cards overlap? We'll take a look at the very end of the video. I'll do a sample reading so you can kind of see what I mean. But what I want to do right now is walk you through each of the individual cards' actual challenges to kind of give you an idea of what all those flavors are. So for the Prism card, the challenge of this one is understanding the scope of what we think. I think that, a lot of times we can get really caught up in kind of the moment and not understand that there's nearly limitless context to what we kind of think and do. And it's not about taking in all that context, because I think that's actually unhelpful, but just kind of expanding things a little bit. If you think about how you might see a situation, we're often looking at it from one side or one perspective, and Prism really challenges us to take a look for anything from multiple sides, multiple perspectives. There's not a lot of changes between these 2 cards as far as alterations go. I don't even think I moved the text. It just looks a little bit lower on the card kind of from the reproduction. Card number 2 is Source. This is the only card in the deck where there is only gold illustration. There is no black pen or black watercolor at all. And it just is so satisfying in the actual card to see all that shimmer and shine. And this is another one of our kind of major cards, if you will. So this card represents spirit, where the previous card represented mind. Now, I was really, really obsessed with this idea of source when I was making this deck. The idea that everything came from something, kind of this one point of source. And the way I kind of conceptualize source in my mind is the idea of walking through a forest, and you get all the way to the center of the forest, and there's this one tree with this kind of golden light shining out from behind it. And that source is right behind it, but you're so exhausted that you collapse in front of the tree and just can't make it. It's like this thing that is kind of in reach, but never really totally attainable. And I personally just love that kind of very mysterious idea of whatever the heart of things are is very unapproachable and difficult to get to. Now, I chose not to depict that tree scene that I was talking about because I wanted everybody to be able to superimpose their own source onto this card. I could think of a million different ways that I've heard this idea of source or oneness or everything described from other, even like tarot decks or other people on YouTube. So I just made it kind of an ephemeral gold light, and it almost looks like light is kind of pouring out of the center of that card. Here you can definitely see some of the errors that I left in. Source, for example, is basically 2 words because I didn't squish my U and my R close enough. I really wanted to keep that kind of stuff because I think it's super duper charming. As far as the challenge of source goes, it's to embrace the mystery. So much of our life is known. We're able to Google anything and everything and just, have information at a glance. Source reminds us Sometimes you just got to let go of that stuff. You can't always know everything. And sometimes it's almost more helpful or more fun or more exciting to not know. I think a lot of us in the tarot community love that idea of kind of embracing the mystery. We literally draw cards out of a deck to, reflect information back at ourselves like a mirror, or tell the future, or, however you use tarot yourself. So that idea is not super foreign, but it's a good reminder just to be like, you know what? Whatever the current situation is, I am going to just embrace a little bit of the unknown, a little bit of the mystery. Number 3 brings us to breadth. Now, this is one of the minor cards, if you will, in the deck. And you can tell that really easily because there is no gold accents on these. It's only black ink and black watercolor. Now here we can see that this is one of these spirit cards filtered through the element of air. So this is kind of the thought, heady, thinking part of spirit. And for spirit, that means universal level mind expansion. The idea of breadth here directly relates to a very occult saying or term called as above, so below. If you're not familiar with it, it's the idea that life is kind of fractal, that things that are extremely small reflect things that are very, very big. So in the image here, we have the nucleus of an atom, and that nucleus is surrounded by orbiting planets and stars and comets. So, I didn't reflect the actual solar system or anything, but I have a planet here with a little moon. There's a comet. There's a planet with some rings. But I definitely wanted to kind of incorporate the idea that the nucleus of an atom has electrons rotating around it, the same way that the sun will have planets rotating around it. And there we can see kind of the rays of what would be the sun on the top. I'm going to stop doing air quotes. It's a good finger workout, but I think it's unnecessary. I might do this anyway. There's not a lot of changes between these two cards as far as the reproduction goes. It stayed pretty darn similar. I actually really like kind of the coldness of these minor cards. These are warm and beautiful and look nice, but there's something very crisp about total white and total black. I think it looks really elegant. Now, the challenge of breadth is to really understand that connection to everything, or even just to consider that connection to everything. I don't think there's a way to actually comprehend, complete oneness or complete connection, but this card challenges you to kind of reach for that. An example that I use in the guidebook for this card is, imagine tripping on the sidewalk, and, you imagine, or you think to yourself like, oh, why did I trip? I wish I wouldn't have tripped. I must have not been paying attention. But if you really, expand your mind and think about it, you tripped on the sidewalk because the concrete was slightly higher in one point than another, and your shoes happened to catch it. But there was a person that poured that concrete. There was somebody who invented concrete. There was millions of years of buildup in the earth to make the rock. The earth itself was made from stardust. That star might have come from a different galaxy. If you trace things back far enough, you could probably connect anything to anything, anywhere in the universe. And now that's not always the most helpful thing. There's actually another card that deals with the challenge of finding the useful information in that. But breadth is big. It's the airy part of spirit. It says, go out there, think as big as you possibly can, think of as much connection as you can get, and relate that huge connection to the internal connections as well. You'll see as we go through this deck that this was 100% made for me. Some of these challenges that you see, you might think like, oh, I don't struggle with that, or that's not a super big universal challenge. And when I was making this deck, that was not on my mind at all. I never ever thought, first, that I'd be showing this to anybody, or two, that I would ever be reproducing it for other people to have. So some of these things are really laser focused on challenges that I faced. So I guess you'll kind of get a little insight into my brain too. Card number 4 here is the fiery part of spirit. So we're still in kind of that spirit set. We're actually going to be in spirit until we get all the way through Earth. This card, of course, is called Compass. This is our first instance of just moving that text up the teeniest, tiniest bit. It was a little bit too low on this one, so I bumped it up just a little bit. And the image here, we see a compass, so north, south, east, and west. But instead of the compass rose, we have a bow and arrow picking a direction. Because the challenge of compass is focusing your efforts. I'm an Aries. I love starting projects, but I have a really hard time finishing projects. That's actually one of the biggest reasons that I started making the Prism Tarot. I wanted to prove to myself that I could complete a big, long, multi-year project, and I will finish it. I'm telling myself right now, Colin, you will finish this project. Because it's just taken about 6 years now, and I think it's time for that one to be done. So for me, this is actually a super duper hard challenge. And even the idea of just picking something that's really important to you and sticking with it can be hard for a lot of people. There is real value to keeping your mind open, taking in lots of information, but there's also value in picking a direction, going with it, and deciding what you want to do. And that's really what we're focusing on here. For card number 5, we have Abyss. Abyss is the watery part of spirit, so kind of that emotional side of spirit. And all these spirit cards are really big, heady things that are kind of difficult to grok. And that's very specific because spirit, regardless of what your interpretation of it, is typically pretty hard to grok. The idea of a deity or a god or a spirit guide or an angel or, however you might view that is very kind of alien to the human experience. And I think that's what makes it so intriguing and why folks like to do stuff like this, dive into your subconscious or get in touch with your spiritual side. As far as the image of Abyss goes, we have the surface of the water here, and these constellations represent our thoughts, our mind kind of, connecting the dots, if you will, and making things that we see. And it's only this tiny little bit of the card. Below that, we have all of this water, and this starts to delve into the subconscious. Up top here, towards the surface, we can see lots of life. There are things kind of being grown, lots of fishies and coral and all that. As we get lower and lower, more weird stuff like jellyfish, and Abyss is actually down here off the card where you can't see it. Now, a neat little note, there's actually an extra branch over here, or an extra bit of seaweed. Again, that's kind of a par for the course thing with printing. You got to make sure there's enough information on the edge of the card that if the card shifts slightly during the flight that is printing, it doesn't cut off in an awkward way. So there's actually a little bit more over there, and that's kind of reconstructed from some of this stuff. Just a neat little Easter egg built in there. Now, the challenge of Abyss is to delve into your subconscious, which can be easier said than done sometimes. The fact that something is subconscious means that you're not thinking about it. If you're thinking about something and thinking like, oh, maybe that's in my subconscious, it's probably not, because that is a conscious thought that you're thinking about actively. And it's certainly possible to get down there, but you really got to dive. You got to work for it. It can be hard to kind of get into those automatic thoughts and like grab hold of the shifter and make them manual for a second. So this can be a tricky challenge to overcome because it's often vague and kind of abstract in the way that you do it. And that's actually one of the reasons that I say draw 2 cards with this deck, because if the challenge is dive into your subconscious, that is a very big task and one that is very vague and is probably undoable in certain ways. But if you're going to dive into your subconscious to help find the direction that you want to go, that all of a sudden gives you something to work with. You're able to kind of start putting pieces together and give you more specificity in the challenge that you're facing, as opposed to just drawing 1 card. So that's personally why I always draw 2. Up next, we have card number 6. I bring them in upside down here just to remind you that this was the card that I chose for the back of the reproduction, just because of how many errors there were. I really loved that kind of handmade quality to it. But as we flip it over, we'll see this is Faith. This is the final card in the Spirit set, so the earthy part of Spirit, the very grounded bit of it. And for me, that's faith. Faith allows us to believe in things that we can't see or can't know. For the image here, we have this kind of black stone monolith, but the base of it gets less and less solid. As it approaches spirit, it's really solid and it's there. But as we go down, it's like losing color, it's losing lines. The thing that holds up faith is very infrequently science or evidence. It is faith itself. It's just the belief that something is true or something is there. The challenge of faith, and this is how I wrote it in the book, is to have it. This is, again, one of those things that I personally really struggle with. I'm a very kind of sciencey minded person for as kind of artsy and free thinking as I am. And it's really tough for me to have faith in something. I got to kind of see it and feel it before I do. And I'm working through that and getting significantly better at it. But for me, this was worthy of its own challenge card. If I was only going to pick 18 things, this was absolutely going to be one of them. And I'll be honest, this was one of the harder ones to kind of face when it came up. A small side note that I forgot at the beginning of the video, I only chose 18 cards for this deck. Most Oracle decks out there have, like between probably 30 and maybe like 70 cards. You typically get a lot more than this, which is totally cool. To each deck their own. For this one though, I didn't want a lot of fluff. I wanted each card to be kind of a heavy hitter and very specific. And I also really wanted it to be based on this system with kind of the cores and the overlapping of things. So there wasn't a lot of room to like jam some more stuff in there. So if you're curious why I didn't make more, that's the reason. And the art collector in me wants this to be like a 90 card deck of like cool illustrations, but I'm actually really glad I limited myself. If you're ever making a creative project, one of the best mantras you can tell yourself is restrictions breed creativity. If you give yourself a blank canvas, it's way too hard to kind of imagine everything. But if you're like, I only get to draw in this circle, all of a sudden your mind starts filling in the gap with like a million ideas because now you have some context, now you have something to work with. That is nothing to do with this card though, so I will stop kind of squirrel braining and going off on tangents. Back to the image here. I talked about this monolith as kind of being founded on faith itself, but up here we have spirit. We have the thing that you're believing in. And it's not gold on this card because it's one of the minors. And it's also not gold because the act of faith, to me, especially at the time of drawing this deck, was like, you're believing in something that may or probably may not be real. And I have adjusted my thoughts on that, but I very specifically drew it as almost like a, haha, take that, religion or whatever. I'm going to draw it in black and not put gold on it. Big Colin, drawn it on my little Oracle deck that I'm not showing anybody. But that's what you see up there. This brings us to card number 7, and I will bring in the reproduction in just a moment here. Before I do though, this is the last of our big 3 major cards. This represents body. And I forget if I said it at the top, but if not, we're gonna go through it again. Another core part of the creation of this deck was the number 217, which probably feels random, and it kind of is in some way. 217 is my personal favorite number. It is basically a sacred number to me at this point. There's a lot of very cool little things that have come up in all my studies of tarot and just in my life around that number. And I find it to be downright magical. The reason I bring it up here is because these first 3 cards, Source, Prism, and Mind, are actually organized the correct way if you put them in 217. Mind actually appears first in the deck, as you can see. Again, that's because everything is filtered through the mind. But here we have Source being filtered through a prism to create light. So this is the quote-unquote correct. I said I'd stop doing the quotes. I'm going to dance a little bit. This is not the quote-unquote. It is the correct order of these cards because I made it, and I can say that. I'm from the Midwest, if you can't tell from the accent, and I think it is like genetically programmed into me to apologize for everything I say and just being alive. So if I was about to apologize for apologizing, I'm not going to do that. We're going to keep talking about the cards. So here we have, like I said, Source through a prism creating light. I won't go like super deep into why 217 is important to me in this particular video. I am going to break down one of the other cards though, because it is very tightly compacted with the number 217, and I think it's kind of cool. So I'll show that off. All right, I'm gonna move these guys out of the way. Let's bring in the reproduction. Just kind of from a visual perspective, this is one of my favorite cards in the deck. I think it's a real stunner. Here we have Source being trapped into physical form. So this is body, this is kind of that spirit collected in something. You can almost think of this as the idea of the soul, or if we reference back to that breadth card from earlier, the idea of as above, so below. If there is a spirit above it, if it's everything, if it's God, if it's whatever, that means that that's also reflected on the small scale, which is us too. And here we can see shadows being cast off the sides of these in kind of an abstract way. Not a lot of changes as far as the reproduction to the normal card goes. I did scooch down the numbers, I think just a skosh. But the challenge of light is that we can only control what we do. I think there's a real kind of like want and desire to be able to control every situation, and for people like to want people to see our point of view, but we only have our own context. We can only perceive things from where we are. And the idea of light is just to remember that. Our actions affect people, and they're going to affect them in a way that makes sense from their perspective. This is another really abstract card if you just take it on its own, but if you cross it over with another card, it gains a lot more clarity. I'm gonna grab this one here again. Let's say light and compass, again, both come up in a reading. Now this is not about finding your direction, but about finding out what is your true purpose, your true life goal. How does that look to other people? And how is that going to affect them? Because all of a sudden, light here is talking about how we're being perceived and how we're affecting things. That very crunchy body part of our human experience. I'm loving that compass card. I'm gonna leave that out. We might just reference that a few more times. Up next, we have plexus, which is our first mixing of two cores. So it's still a core card, it's in gold, but it is spirit meeting mind. So where does the divine kind of meet our actual thought process? And the challenge of plexus is almost the opposite of breadth from earlier. It's about deciding what is actually important in a life of near limitless context and near limitless potentiality for connection. I think potential is the word I was reaching for there. What's actually important? If you take that story I told earlier about tripping on the sidewalk and considering who made the concrete and where did the concrete come from, and the fact that our planet is made of stone that might have come from a different star, that's not going to help you if you trip on the sidewalk. You need a more immediate solution than that. So here we can see kind of all these different points of information, almost like stars in the background. And up close, we see some of those points kind of magnified, but only some of them are connected. There is no connection between these 2 points here. There's no connection between these 2 points or these 2 points. Only some of these things matter. And I think that's really important to kind of keep in mind through life in general, because the things that you do, the things that you give your mind space for are important, and everything takes up a little bit of our mind and we can only hold so much. So it's really about finding the things that are very important to you. Now, spirit and mind crossing over here, this is going to bring us into the next section of those minor cards, which will be the mind. So the mind now through the lens of earth, air, fire, and water. Let's take a look. Up first, we have space. This is card number 9. And the order that I put these in is always the same. So once we get to say mind or to body or to source, it always starts with air, then goes fire, then water, then earth. If you're familiar with the symbols for these, the symbol of air is an upward facing triangle with a line through it. Fire is then an upward facing triangle. Water is a, downward facing triangle. And earth is a downward facing triangle with a line through it. So we're going from the very highest, kind of most ephemeral element, a little more earthy, a little bit more earthy, until we finally get to earth, the kind of chunkiest, most grounded. Looking at these cards here, this is one of my favorite error reproductions. There's a tiny little drop of gold ink that I spilled on this card that you can actually see here too. And it's a little bit hard to tell right then and there, but it actually is gold. And I just love that a little bit of gold snuck into one of the minor cards, especially one that I like so much. For the image of space here, we have kind of this open blank canvas just being assaulted by ideas and stuff and just this, darkness trying to get in. And the idea of dark and light is not so much at work here. I guess you could read it that way. But this is more just the idea of ideas, just things trying to get in and compressing down against the surface of this bubble, essentially. The challenge with space is to give your mind space. So almost from like a mindfulness meditation standpoint, if your mind is just too full of things, there is never room for you to kind of think new thoughts or think about the stuff that you want or just see what naturally bubbles up to the surface. If we're always constantly engaged with something, always constantly thinking about it, we never have time to kind of sit back and see what's there. So this card is all about giving yourself that space to kind of let things percolate to the surface. Let your subconscious do a little bit of work. If this is crossing over with the Abyss card, it might really be about diving into that ambiguity of it, like just seeing literally what bubbles to the surface of your subconscious. Give yourself space, let it bubble up. I'm loving this compass card. If we're bringing in compass here, this is all about saying okay, what is my true purpose and calling? I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to actively not think about it, give myself space, and then within that space, see where my mind is pointing me. Just from a visual aspect, I like this card a lot just because it's very busy. I actually tend to like busy compositions quite a bit. That juxtaposes nicely with the white space on the side. I'm just glancing. I don't think there was any changes between the reproduction and the original. Just kind of a nice, in some ways, very straightforward card, but it's just got one of those annoyingly mind-bending Zenny challenges to it of clear your mind. Easier said than done. It's 2019. I got stuff to do. Coming in hot at number 10 is Flame. Flame is the fiery part of mind, so that very active, passionate part of how we think. From a visual standpoint, we see a stick becoming fire. And I really wanted it not to be on fire, but to actually be becoming fire. And then the fire to be kind of swirly and ephemeral, because this is sort of how I visualize imagination. When you're a kid, a stick doesn't look like a sword, it is a sword, or a rock is a car, or, whatever, a bush is a house, whatever it might be. So this idea that the things that we see can be something else, the thoughts that we think can kind of manifest into something cool and creative. But also realizing that inspiration is hard to come by and, thinking's hard. So there are these little leaves on these branches too. So when we're not feeling inspired, there's still a little bit of growth, a little bit of hope. The challenge of Flame is to find inspiration. And not to find inspiration passively, but to seek inspiration actively, which is easier said than done. As active as a card as this feels, I've often found that in practice, it's a very kind of treat yourself card. One of the ways that I gather inspiration artistically is taking in art. Maybe it's looking through a deck of tarot cards. Maybe it's watching some TV or watching an animated show. I think, getting other content pulled into yourself is a great way to kind of gestate and churn through ideas. The idea of, plexus, making meaningful combinations. The more unique points of information you can give yourself, the more chance there is for weird things to cross over. And those weird crossovers tend to lead towards really cool innovations and nearly always inspiration for me. If I could pick any card in the deck to just be I could do this on demand, I would probably pick this, because as an artist, you need to be able to draw something. And I don't know how it is for all of you out there, but for me, if I'm not feeling inspired, art is not happening, which is very frustrating. So this is another kind of hyper-personal challenge for me that just speaks really loud and annoyingly. Up next, we have Doubt. Doubt is the watery part of mind. So the kind of emotional side of how we think, or the deep, churny side of how we think. And I'm not sure about, you out there on YouTube land, but I am a homegrown worrier. I worry about everything, and that includes worrying about worrying. I'm actually worried about how much I'm saying worried right now. And that was the inspiration for this little image right here. The idea that the solution is right there, but it's sort of tied up in, all these strings. So if you move one, maybe it won't come off, or who knows what's holding these strings, maybe it'll move. Just all this kind of tension I tried to build into the image itself. Now, I called the card Doubt here, because doubt is, in my mind, very tied to worry as well. And doubt feels more action kind of based than worry does. Worry is very passive. Worry washes over you. Doubt cuts into you and is something that, a challenge-based deck is more able to focus on. The problem with doubt is that it can be really cyclical. If you doubt something, you could doubt your reasonings for doubting it. You could doubt evidence against it. You could doubt your own evidence towards it. There's all these things that you could doubt. And because it's not believing something, there's nothing tangible. There's nothing that you can grab onto. It's this very ephemeral, hard idea to kind of tackle. So the challenge of doubt is to face something that you've been avoiding. I think avoiding something is one of the perfect warning signs that you kind of doubt it, whether it's your ability to do something or your willingness or want to do something or believing that it's worth doing something or not. Those types of things tend to be real pain points for us, things that are uncomfortable in some way. And doubt challenges us to look at those. And then, of course, in context with another card, what specific one of those things are we going to look at? Maybe it's, what I want to do with my life. It's compass again. Welcome back, compass. That doubt might be, how is this going to affect me financially or, my family or something? There's something holding me back from what I want to do. I'm going to tackle that doubt directly. This brings us to the final card in the mind section. This is Earth of Mind, symbol number 12. And here, the number 217. This is one of my personal symbols. I made this for myself to kind of remind me that studying is important and keeping an open mind is important. It is heavily based on the number 217. I'm actually going to go real deep with you here and kind of break down how I made this symbol in just a second. The challenge of symbol is to construct something that is consistent. Symbols are consistent and they are also physical. For example, letters are symbols that we use to communicate with each other. An S always looks like an S. A Y always looks like a Y. That way it means the same thing and is consistent every time. I think the act of actually making something, whether it's a affirmational phrase for yourself or an image that you can relate to or finding a picture of something or naming a line that you drew, just something very physical, personal, and consistent helps you bring it into focus. Ideas can be very ephemeral. Life can feel very kind of abstract sometimes. So any amount of physicality we can bring to it, I always find to be extremely helpful. This then combined with another card tells you what kind of literal symbol do you need to make? How is that symbol going to help you reinforce whatever you're trying to overcome and beat that challenge? As far as the reproduction goes here, it's pretty straightforward. I want to break this symbol down for you now, but I'm going to show you a different version of it just because this one is not drawn the best just because I had to draw it, one time only. So we will cut away and do that now. So here we can see a book on top of a triangle, and just super surface level, books to me represent knowledge, and to many folks. You read a book to discover. A book is also a four-sided shape, so it's a square, and the number 4 is very earthy. Think the 4 cardinal directions or the 4 classical elements. So it's all about learning and learning specifically earthy things, kind of tangible things. Behind it, we have a triangle with some rays coming out of it. And triangles are, of course, a 3-sided shape, and 3s typically are a very spiritual number. Think Father, Son, and Holy Spirit from kind of the Christian religion. There's all sorts of those that you could apply. They're not coming to mind immediately. But where 4 is a very earthy number, 3 is a very kind of spiritual number. So right off the bat, we have 4 meeting 3. We have kind of that overlap of the physical and the spiritual. That's also reflected on the pages of the book as well. There are 4 lines on the left page, 3 lines on the right page. So we have, again, the physical meeting the spiritual. Within those shapes, though, we also have the number 217. What I mean by that, let's take the whole symbol, for example. There are 2 items in this symbol that make up one complete shape or one complete symbol, and there are 7 sides to it. 4 sides on the book, 3 sides on the triangle. 2, 1, 7. That's also reflected in the book itself. There are 2 pages that are a part of one book, and on those pages there are 7 lines. So again, we have 2, 1, 7 just kind of baked into the symbol itself, kind of visually speaking. Now, another huge component of this symbol is something called English gematria. Now, gematria is a practice where you assign numeric values to letters, and then you kind of add up the letters to help build correlations. So now the way that English gematria works, and this is not something I came up with, but something I kind of stumbled across, it's actually based on the number 217, which I think is so cool. So let's say you take the English alphabet and you break it into 2 chunks. We're going to snip it right at M and N. So that's our 2, the English language in 2 strips. And then we're going to count from the number 1 to the number 7. So A and N are stacked up. They will be assigned the number 1. B and O are stacked up. They'll be assigned the number 2. So on and so forth until we get to G and T, which is the number 7. And then we count back down to 1. Now, when we look at a word, we can see that if it has a D in it, that D is worth 4. So when we kind of do our kind of occult math, if you will, that's going to be our key to unraveling it. Now, all of this stuff that I'm trying to pack in is based around the word revelation to me. I think revelation is a super cool, powerful word. It is that moment of understanding. It's that aha moment, if you will, which again kind of relates back to the book sitting on top of the triangle. It's that moment almost when something physical feels like it becomes spiritual. You kind of unlock something within you. If we take the word revelation and lay it out and put all of the numerical values from our key that we used for English gematria in, we will see that right kind of in the dead center of revelation is the number 217 over LAT. And then we have 4 letters on the left-hand side and 3 letters on the right. So again, this is kind of reflecting that 4, very earthly, meeting the 3, which is the very spiritual. And then with between those 2 things in the word revelation is the number 217, which for me kind of represents this source that we've been talking about the whole time. It's this thing that is neither, spirit or body. It's kind of the everything in between them. So that's represented very literally, numerically within the word revelation applied with English gematria. Now, if you add up the 4 letters on the left of revelation and the 3 letters on the right, the 5555 over REVE adds up to 20. And then the ION adds up to 8 on the other side. So that is a 28. If we just break apart that 8, it is 1 plus 7. So 217 also surrounds that central 217 in some ways as well. If this kind of nitpicky break apart math bothers you, probably just skip this section because that's a lot of what gematria is, whether it's English or otherwise. It's kind of combining and breaking apart numbers in this way. I think this is kind of cool though, that within the word revelation, we have the divine touching and meeting the mundane. And that's represented by those numbers being on either side of the number 217. We have that divine 3 meeting the mundane 4. Okay, cool. So we have some 217s baked in there. Let's add up all the numbers in Revelation. That gives us the number 38 if we were to add up every single letter step by step. Now, I have broken up 38 into 13 and 25. you'll notice that there are 13 lines on the top of the symbol here and 25 lines on the bottom. So the number of lines in the triangle in the background directly reflect the word revelation, numerically speaking. Now, I've done a bunch of extra English gematria to fit in some words that sort of apply in a circle around here. So words that add up to 13. The two that I chose to use were God and art. Now, God in this context is not referring to a specific God, a masculine God. It's just referring to the idea of everything. I think God is a very convenient term that people can understand to kind of relate to that all or that source. So God is on top, or art is on top, and then on the bottom, the two words that I chose were seeks and forge. Now, when I say I chose these words, I did the math. Let's take seeks, for example, and you'll see that if you add up all the numbers in seeks, that equals 25. All the numbers in forge add up to 25. All the numbers in God, all the numbers in art, both add up to 13. So through a gematria lens, those words are related to those numbers and are then somehow connected to each other. So let's take these words and kind of build a sentence with them. Seeks, for example. God seeks art, seeks God. It's this cyclical idea that as creators, as people who are making art, we are constantly trying to seek the divine. At least I can certainly say that for myself. The things that I create, I'm trying to speak to something higher, something bigger than myself. If I could just express all of my ideas through words, I would, but I can't, so I make things. The other thing is, or the other way to read this is, art forges God, forges art, or just forge art, forge God, if we want to use the exact word here. If you make something, you create the divine. The idea that the divine is within all of us, and all we have to do is manifest it for it to be real. So whether you believe that God is real, or spirit is real, or aliens are real, or whatever you think of as the divine, you can create that. It's that idea of manifesting, of making. So forge art, forge God, or God seeks art, seeks God. These cyclical phrases are built into the DNA of this symbol as well, which again just reminds me to learn, but keep that learning less grounded and a little bit more in that kind of magical spiritual realm. Hopefully this was interesting. That is the bits that I packed into the image for symbol here. I hope you kind of like the little extra breakdown on this one. Let's get back to the rest of the deck. All right, I'm gonna reel it back in here a little bit for craft, number 13. Now this brings us back to one of our core cards with our luscious gold ink again. And this is the overlap of mind meeting body. So now we're moving into the body section here, coming from mind. So we'll explore those cards next. And the challenge of craft is to refine what you do, whatever that might be. For me, it's visual art. For someone, it might be poetry. For somebody else, it might be math or accounting or how you relate to your family. There is no version of this that is better or worse. To each, their own. Everyone will kind of experience this different. But whatever we do, we can do it masterfully. If, you work on an assembly line and you tighten the same screw every day, what's the perfect, angle to move things to? If you're going to write music, how do you keep your instrument perfectly in tune and play it, flawlessly? There's always another level that you can reach to kind of up your game. From a visual standpoint here, we have kind of the thoughty, heady world of ideas swirling around up here, being channeled through an instrument. For me, that's a pencil, because I like to draw, and then being executed in any number of ways, kind of all these lines crisscrossing off to the side. Now the tool here is just symbolic. It could be a microphone, it could be a broom, it could be anything that you do. But, it's my deck, so I thought I'd draw a pencil because I like pencils. And then behind it, there is this dark shape, just reminding us that there is, kind of infinite space to replace this with whatever is important to you. Whatever your craft is, you can feel free to superimpose that on this card. There have been no alterations between as far as moving things up or down. Actually, now that I look at this, I might have scooched up the text just a little bit. That might be super boring. I hope it's not. I find it fascinating personally. One of the reasons it was so hard to make a digital version of this is a card like this one. If you're not familiar with the printing process, you need something called a bleed, which is a little bit of extra stuff around the card. So when it's actually stamped out or cut out, if the card shifts slightly, there's extra stuff to look at. If I literally took this card and say print it, if this card shifted slightly, you'd see those lines abruptly end and there would be white paper beyond them. So this card I had to kind of go in and recreate more lines around the outside, which meant grabbing samples of lines from in here because I wanted the grain of the paper to be the same. I wanted the texture to be the same. And with all these little swirly curly cues, it just made for a lot of stuff. This is the perfect example right here. That little guy right in the corner, you can see more of it over here. That's because this card shifted slightly and I just invented more of that shape, which was kind of fun. It was super cool, but what a pain in the butt. So if you're curious why it might be difficult to take something like this and turn it digital, that's typically the reason why. Coming in at number 14 is Lux. This is the first card in the body section. So we have the airy part of body. And this is one of those where I scooched up the text a little bit on the reproduction because it got awfully close to the edge on the bottom there. And I just wanted you to be able to see everything on the card. Lux, the challenge for this one is understanding how you see yourself outside in and making sure that aligns with how you see yourself inside out. This is literally a card of physical appearances in some way. And that's not to say that there is a right or wrong physical appearance. I am a full proponent of, everyone is beautiful. The way you see yourself is beautiful. And, loving yourself for what you are is one of the most important things and one of the best gifts that you can give yourself. But that being said, we all do see ourselves in some way. And, for a lot of us, it's not always a lot of self-love. Sometimes we can be pretty hard on, who we are. I chose Lux for the name on this card because it sounds like luxury, but the way this is spelled, this is the Latin word for light. So it's not about luxury. It's not about kind of the way we present ourselves and the things that we adorn ourselves with, but about our inner light. How can we let our inner light shine and let that be the thing that people see and let that be the thing that we're really proud of? And, hopefully also be really proud of who we are physically along the way too. I think often though that change has to kind of start from the inside and then work its way out. For the image here, I chose to represent this as a badge. Wow, that word was not coming to mind. Again, kind of the luxury bit, something that you have to earn or be proud of. But on that badge, there is a sun and a little arrow pointing up. This sun is representing light, the actual lux of the card. And that little arrow pointing up is reminding us that it's the higher self. It's that light within us that's the important part, not the actual badge itself. So it's a little bit of a crisscross image, something that you may not see on first glance. At number 15, we have happiness, the fiery part of body. Fire, again, being kind of that passion or the movement. The challenge of happiness is to live in the moment. And that's depicted here in this admittedly more abstract image than some of the other ones we've seen. Here we have a clock that is pointing at a timeline. This is the timeline of somebody's life, and it's exactly the moment we're at. And there are these little tick marks on the timeline as well. I kind of thought of those as major life events, but it's not pointing at one of those. It's pointing at wherever the heck you are right now, but kind of celebrating that moment with the sort of explosion around the side. Living in the moment is not often easy, and it's very rarely glamorous. That might be sitting in traffic right now, or drinking coffee, or being annoyed because somebody sent a rude email. Whatever it is, that is the moment you're currently experiencing, and the only moment we can ever really truly experience is right now. The past is in the past, the future has yet to come. All we can do is experience the moment we're currently in, which can be really, really hard to do. And then hopefully from that kind of experience, we can find some happiness. It's really easy if you're in the exact moment of right now to just kind of forgive maybe what just happened to you 5 seconds ago or what you anticipate is going to happen. Let's say someone's yelling at you in line at the grocery store. If you're just thinking like, I'm alive right now, I'm breathing, you can be happy in that moment, even though the moment is very stressful. Yeah, I was going to say something more, but I'm going to kind of embrace the moment, embrace this happiness, and call that. Oh my gosh, we're getting there. Moving on to card 16. It's acceptance. That didn't rhyme. Okay. Acceptance is another one of those cards for me that was like, ooh, okay, I'm going to make this a card. This is the watery part of body. As you can see, I scratched out the word mind and wrote body. And I also made a big error up here with watercolor. I think it is so kind of cosmically funny that I screwed up the acceptance card. I made a literal error and had to change it. And obviously I kept it in because I thought it was kind of so important to the deck itself. The challenge of acceptance is accepting who you are. And it's not about the kind of physicality that Lux brings. This is on a core level, like, you are something. There are probably parts of you that you don't like, and yet we must accept them. This was one that was super duper hard for me and will probably be hard for me for a while. This is not the kind of card that you're like, oh, I'm going to flip over the acceptance card and like, oh, I really should accept that I have green eyes. Like, okay, I'm good with that now. Like, this is one of those lifetime cards for me. And that's why I'm actually glad that, you bring in another card, because let's bring on Compass back in. Compass really kind of takes some of the edge off the acceptance card, because now it's not about accepting the whole totality. It's about like, how can I focus that a little bit more in a more specific direction? Just visually, this is also the only card where I colored the entire thing with black ink. So it's a very kind of gray card. It stands out a lot if you were to put all these in a big row. From an image perspective, we have a boat at the bottom of the ocean. And, the water's kind of dark and a little bit particulate-y, got some kind of crap floating around. And the reason I picked this image was this boat's at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody knows what it is. It's no longer completing its purpose, but it's still a boat. A boat is a boat no matter where it is, no matter what it's doing. Just like we are what we are, no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing. And also from the fact that, dealing with something like acceptance often feels like you literally have to dive down to a wrecked ship and like drudge it back up to the surface. It's hard. Nobody wants to be there. There's a lot of pressure involved with it. It feels dark. I don't like being wet either, so you also have to be wet and there's sand. It's just very uncomfortable. The whole thing just feels very uncomfortable. I'm going to, in fact, move on to the next card, because this card, I think, can be very impactful, but also makes me really uncomfortable. The last card in the body sequence, we have the earthy part of body, which is health. The challenge of health is understanding that, we all need healing and that takes time. It's a little bit of a breath of fresh air after acceptance, because this one keeps wanting to like push its way back in. It's like, nope, I get it, we're healing, and then moving on. This healing can come in many ways, and that is reflected with the image as well. We see things like maybe a drop of blood or water. We see a Band-Aid. We see roots and seeds and a pill and all sorts of stuff. Healing can be mental. It can be physical. It could be getting in shape. It could be kind of, going to therapy or something like that. There are many ways that healing can express itself. And again, a very broad term with the health card, but then you pair that with another challenge and it helps to give you a little bit more context for what you're doing. This is one of the more straightforward cards in the deck. Health is kind of what it is. Things get hurt, they need healing. That's what you got to do. It's just a matter of figuring out what that requires and how you're going to go about it. Last but certainly not least, we have blending, card number 18. This is another one of our core cards. So we have that beautiful gold ink and it's just juicy. I love it. Blending is body meeting spirit. So this is taking us from the bottom here and just taking us all the way back to the top of that circle. The challenge of blending is to give yourself permission to wonder. again, this was something that I made for me, and not having a lot of faith, not having a lot of kind of the spiritual element to my life, allowing myself to wonder and just sort of being engrossed in the story and the fantasy that life can be sometimes is really hard. So how do you take that very physical, part of our lives and the very spiritual part and let those just cross over a little bit? And this can look really different for lots of different people. For me, this card often is kind of allowing myself to have a childlike wonder about something, looking at a puddle and imagining that it's an ocean, or looking at a bush and imagining that it's some crazy hotel for bugs or something. For some people, this might be something like religion, allowing yourself to interact with a spirit or a deity. It could be allowing yourself to embrace magic, or a certain kind of practice or spell work, or even like something like reading tarot cards. There is no set path to how this looks. It's my current worldview that, there's probably some sort of truth out there, but it's at the top of the mountain and you can take any old path to get to the top of the mountain. There's really not a right or wrong necessarily. But blending for me is all about starting the journey, or, if you're on the journey, continuing on, not plateauing, just giving yourself time and permission and, the ability to kind of embrace that magic. Guys, that brings us to the end of the 18 Oracle. That is all the cards, all the challenges. I'm going to come back here in just a moment and give a couple of final wrap-up thoughts. And even though Compass has been sneaking back in a few times, we'll do one final sample reading with drawing 2 cards, seeing what the overlap and challenge is, and calling it a day. Ha ha! I've caught you again. You thought I forgot about the order of the deck. I wanted to describe why I put the cards in the order I did. Why is blending number 18? Why is compass number 4? And for that, I created a visual aid, because visual aids are great. Let me flip this guy over here. And it's actually quite simple. The structure here is that we have each of the minor cards for each section. So spirit of air, fire, water, and earth. Then we have the blending card in between them, so spirit meeting mind. And then we have the 4 cards for mind. So each of the 3 cores filtered through the 4 elements. And then when 2 cores meet, boom, we have the blending card in between them, with body meeting spirit, taking us all the way back to the top. And then by now, I'm sure you've realized my obsession with the number 217. These 3 core cards, spirit, mind, and body, are just filtered in at the 2, 1, and 7 slots, which just kind of shift things around a little bit. This has been the visual aid. I hope you've enjoyed. So last but not least, a sample reading. These are the original cards that I'm using, and boy, are they a pain in the butt to shuffle, because it's basically like trying to shuffle cardboard tiles. I often even do just a little bit of, oh, there's a little fuzz friend. Goodbye, fuzz friend. A little bit of a pile shuffle maneuver here to kind of spread things out and kind of just get them going. Oh, see how great I'm doing here? Not the easiest thing in the whole world to shuffle, but that is okay. That feels right. I no longer remember where light is in the deck. Let's draw 2 and see what my next challenge to overcome is. All right, we have doubt, of course, and space. Okay. So the challenge of doubt is about taking action on something that you've avoided, and the challenge of space is about giving your brain space to think. So in this case, I would interpret this as someone who doesn't even know what's holding them back. They're feeling stuck, but they can't identify it. They're almost feeling like this key. They're like, everything's pulling me in all these directions. But as is with most things, there's typically like a core something that's pulling at us, or there's a bigger nagging issue that maybe you don't have the mental space or the desire to look at. So the challenge here would be to give yourself space to find what you need to take action on. This is a very kind of contemplative spread. How can you just remove some distractions from your life? Maybe even remove some of the worry. That way, the big foundational things can make their way in and kind of make themselves present to you so you then know what to tackle. This is a challenge to lead to another challenge, it seems, because once we find out what we have to tackle, we then have to tackle it. But I would use a different tool besides this to figure out how to tackle that problem. The real challenge here to me seems like who we're reading for, which is probably me, because this deck is kind of brutal that way. There's so much kind of vying for attention that you need to clear it out to find what the real root is. Thank you again so much, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed this walkthrough of the 18 Oracle. I feel like I was just babbling on for a long time. Hopefully it was interesting. If you are interested in seeing more with this deck, I do post things to my Instagram every now and then around this. A lot of it is my tarot deck, and I'm also making a playing card deck too. So much like this, there's a lot of stuff kind of vying for attention currently in my own brain. But I'll try and give a little 18 Oracle love too. Thanks again, everybody. Goodbye.